I learned exactly how much my son valued me the morning he stared at my check from the ranch sale and spoke to me like I was just another problem to be solved. The envelope was still warm from my hands when Jason leaned against my kitchen counter, tapping his fingers in a rhythm that didn't belong in a home built on 40 years of quiet sacrifice. Outside, the late spring wind rolled across the fields one last time before they would belong to someone else, bending the tall grass in slow, familiar waves that I had watched from this same window since I was a young bride. I remember thinking how strange it was that something so vast could feel so small once it was reduced to numbers printed on paper. I had spent the morning folding laundry, rinsing coffee cups, and trying not to think about the silence that had settled into every corner of the house since Harold passed. Ranch life had always been loud in its own gentle way, full of distant engines, creaking fences, and the low hum of cattle moving across open land, but grief had a way of swallowing even the widest horizons. When Jason first started coming by more often after the funeral, I told myself it was love. He brought groceries I didn't ask for, tightened loose hinges on cabinet doors that had never bothered me before, and stood too long at the dining table staring at paperwork he pretended not to understand. He had always been practical, even as a boy, the kind of child who counted his Halloween candy before he tasted it, but something in his voice had changed lately, something sharp hiding beneath all that concern. That morning he watched me sign the final documents with an expression I couldn't quite read, like he was waiting for a race to begin. "So it's done," he said, not as a question, more like a confirmation of something he had already decided. I nodded and placed the check inside a drawer beside the stove, the same drawer where I used to keep Harold's handwritten notes about rainfall and feed costs. Jason's eyes followed the motion. I could feel the weight of his attention in a way that made my shoulders tighten even though the room was warm. For a long moment we stood there listening to the old refrigerator cycle on and off, the clock above the sink marking time in steady, unforgiving ticks. I thought about the years Harold and I had spent building that ranch from borrowed equipment and stubborn faith, about the winters when we measured success in inches of snow and the summers when we fell asleep still smelling of dust and hay. I thought about how proud Jason used to be when he ran across those fields with his arms wide, pretending he could fly. The man standing in my kitchen now did not look like that boy. He looked tired, restless, and strangely certain that whatever was mine should eventually become his. When he finally spoke again, his tone was softer, almost reasonable, and that frightened me more than anger ever could. He began talking about investments, about opportunity, about how money sitting still was a waste of potential. He spoke in smooth, careful sentences that sounded rehearsed, like he had practiced them in the car before coming inside. I listened without interrupting, wiping a spot on the countertop that wasn't really there, trying to understand when our conversations had become negotiations. It wasn't that I didn't want to help him. I had spent my whole life helping him. I just didn't understand why help suddenly had a deadline attached to it. The afternoon light shifted across the floorboards, turning gold as it slipped through the window, and I realized with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that this moment mattered more than the sale of any land. This was the moment I would decide whether my future still belonged to me. Jason stepped closer, lowering his voice as if we were sharing a secret. He spoke about debts I had never heard of, plans he had never mentioned, and dreams that somehow required my signature before they could exist. I folded my hands together and looked at him the way I used to when he was small and trying to explain why he had broken something valuable. Only this time there was no apology waiting at the end of his story. There was only expectation. I told him quietly that I needed time, that the money was meant to secure the rest of my life, that Harold had trusted me to make wise decisions even when they were difficult. Jason's jaw tightened in a way that reminded me of storms rolling in from the west, sudden and impossible to stop once they had gathered enough force. The kitchen felt smaller then, the walls closer, the air heavier with words we had not yet said. I remember reaching for the edge of the table to steady myself, not because I was afraid of him, but because I was afraid of what I might see if I looked too closely at his eyes. Somewhere in the distance a truck drove past on the county road, its tires crunching gravel like an echo of the life I had just sold. Jason exhaled slowly, as if patience itself were a burden he was tired of carrying. In that quiet, suspended moment between what he wanted and what I was willing to give, I realized something that would change everything that followed. My son wasn't asking for my help. He was asking for my surrender. And I was not prepared to give him either. I did not sleep much that night. The house seemed to hold its breath along with me. Every familiar sound stretched thin by the knowledge that something inside my life had shifted in a way that could not be undone. I sat at the small kitchen table long after Jason left, tracing the grain of the wood with my fingertips, remembering the day Harold and I had found it at a roadside auction for $40 and a promise to refinish it ourselves. We had laughed at how heavy it was, how impractical it seemed to haul it all the way back in the pickup truck, but we had been younger then, strong enough to believe that effort could turn anything into home. The memory felt like a photograph fading at the edges, beautiful but increasingly distant. Outside, the pasture lights flickered on one by one as dusk settled over the land that was no longer mine. I had thought selling the ranch would bring relief, a kind of quiet freedom from the endless maintenance and rising property taxes, yet instead it felt as though I had traded one weight for another, more invisible burden that pressed steadily against my ribs. Jason's words replayed in my mind with a persistence that made my temples ache. He had spoken with such certainty about what should happen next, about how he could manage everything better, faster, smarter. I had seen that look before in the eyes of men at livestock auctions, the look that calculated value before sentiment, profit before memory. It unsettled me to realize my own son had begun to measure me the same way. The next morning I woke before sunrise out of habit, pulling on a sweater even though the late spring air had already turned mild. I poured coffee into Harold's old enamel mug and stepped onto the porch, letting the stillness wrap around me like a familiar blanket. In the distance a lone bird called into the pale blue sky, its voice echoing across fields that would soon belong to strangers. I wondered if they would notice how the wind changed direction just before a storm, or how the soil near the north fence held moisture longer than the rest. These were the kinds of details Harold had trusted me to remember, the quiet knowledge that turned survival into something close to grace. As the sun rose, I made a list at the kitchen counter, writing slowly in neat block letters the way my third-grade teacher had once insisted. Bank appointment. Legal review. New locks for the back door. Each item felt like a small declaration that my life was not over simply because one chapter had closed. I knew Jason would return. He had always been persistent when he wanted something, circling a decision like a hawk above an open field. Part of me wished I could give in just to restore the fragile peace that had existed between us before money complicated every conversation. But another part of me, steadier and older, understood that peace built on surrender was only another form of loss. By mid-morning the phone began to ring. His name flashed across the screen again and again, followed by a message filled with urgency disguised as concern. He spoke about deadlines and opportunities, about how waiting could cost us both. I set the phone face down on the table and listened instead to the tick of the wall clock, grounding myself in something that did not change depending on someone else's expectations. I spent the afternoon sorting through boxes Harold had never had the chance to organize, uncovering yellowed photographs and brittle receipts from decades of hard seasons and small victories. With each memory I felt my resolve settle deeper into place, like posts driven firmly into the earth. Late in the day, my neighbor Martha stopped by with a pie she insisted she had baked by accident, though I suspected she had sensed my loneliness the way she always did. We sat together on the porch steps watching the horizon turn soft with evening light, speaking about ordinary things that felt suddenly precious. I did not tell her everything, only that Jason and I were seeing the future differently now. She nodded in that quiet, understanding way of hers, as if she knew more than I had said. When she left, I locked the door behind her and stood in the dim hallway listening to the silence return. Somewhere in that silence I realized that the hardest part was not losing the ranch or even facing my son's disappointment. The hardest part was accepting that the woman I had spent my whole life being for others would have to change if I wanted to protect what remained of myself. I turned off the lights one by one, leaving only the lamp beside Harold's chair glowing in the corner, and promised him softly that I would not let our years of work be reduced to a single transaction or a hurried demand. Whatever came next, I would meet it on my own terms. I drove into town the following Tuesday with the windows rolled down and the radio turned off, letting the sound of the tires on the asphalt remind me that forward motion was still possible even when everything else felt uncertain. The bank sat at the end of Main Street exactly where it had been for as long as I could remember, its brick walls sun-faded but sturdy, like an old promise that refused to disappear. I parked beneath a maple tree that had already begun to shed tiny green leaves onto the hood of my car, and sat there for a moment with my hands resting quietly in my lap, gathering the kind of courage that does not look dramatic from the outside but feels enormous from within. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polished floors and paper, and for a brief second I was transported back to the first loan Harold and I had signed decades earlier, when we still believed risk was simply another word for hope. The young teller greeted me with a brightness that felt both kind and distant, her smile practiced in a way that reminded me how many private storms must pass through a place like this every day. I explained that I needed to review my accounts, to understand exactly what had changed now that the land was no longer ours. Numbers appeared on the screen with clinical precision, rows of digits that represented years of sunburned shoulders, early mornings, and nights spent calculating feed costs by lamplight. I listened carefully as she spoke about options and protections, about ways to ensure that the future I had just purchased for myself would not be easily redirected by anyone else's urgency. When she mentioned the possibility of placing certain funds into a trust, something inside me steadied. It was not about secrecy or defiance. It was about responsibility, the quiet kind Harold had always trusted me to carry. After the meeting I stepped outside into the warm noon light, and realized my phone had filled with messages while I was inside. Jason's voice, tight with frustration, echoed through each one even before I pressed play. He spoke faster than usual, as if time itself were working against him, repeating the same arguments with slightly different words, insisting that delays could ruin everything he had planned. I leaned against the cool metal of my car and closed my eyes, letting his urgency wash over me without responding. The town moved around me in small, ordinary ways. A delivery truck rumbled past. Someone laughed from the diner across the street. A child's bicycle bell chimed somewhere out of sight. Life continued, indifferent to the tension that had begun to define my days. On the drive home I stopped at a hardware store and purchased new locks, the clerk asking if I needed help carrying the box, even though it was light enough to lift with one hand. There was something grounding about holding those small brass cylinders, knowing they represented a boundary I had the right to draw. By the time I reached the house the sun had shifted westward, throwing long shadows across the gravel drive that Harold had spread himself one summer when money was too tight to hire help. I worked slowly, methodically, replacing each lock with the kind of focus that left no room for doubt. The click of metal settling into place sounded almost ceremonial, like the closing of a chapter one had not chosen but could no longer ignore. Later that evening Jason arrived without calling ahead, his car door slamming harder than necessary, his footsteps quick across the porch boards. I opened the door before he could knock, meeting his eyes with a calm I had not known I possessed. He began speaking immediately, his words tumbling over one another in a rush to be heard, to be accepted, to be obeyed. I listened the way I had learned to listen during long negotiations at cattle sales, patient and observant, searching for the truth hidden beneath the noise. When he finally paused for breath I told him gently that I had made arrangements to secure the funds for my own future, that I would consider helping him once I understood his plans fully and on my own timeline. The disappointment that crossed his face was sharp enough to sting even though he did not raise his voice. He looked around the kitchen as if trying to recognize a place that had suddenly become unfamiliar territory. For a moment I saw confusion there. A flicker of the boy who used to run barefoot across pasture grass without worrying about anything beyond the next meal. Then it was gone, replaced by a determination that felt colder than anger. He left soon after, the sound of his engine fading down the county road like a question I was not yet ready to answer. I stood at the window watching the dust settle and realized that protecting myself was not an act of cruelty. It was the only way to ensure that everything Harold and I had built would mean something beyond the sum printed on a bank statement. I began to notice the changes not in what Jason said but in what he stopped saying, in the pauses that grew longer between our conversations and in the way his visits became more purposeful, less like the spontaneous drop-ins of a son who simply missed his mother. The following week unfolded with a quiet tension that seemed to settle into the walls like dust, visible only when the afternoon light struck at the right angle. I spent my mornings organizing drawers that had not been opened in years, folding old letters into neat stacks and deciding which memories deserved to follow me into whatever life came next. Each envelope carried the scent of time, faint and stubborn as if the past itself refused to loosen its grip. Harold had always believed that order was a form of respect, both for what had been and for what was still possible, and I found comfort in honoring that belief even now. On Wednesday, Brittany called for the first time since the sale was finalized, her voice polished and bright in a way that felt carefully constructed. She asked about my health, about whether I was eating enough, about how I was adjusting to the idea of leaving the land. Beneath her concern I could hear the faint ticking of another clock, one that measured opportunity rather than healing. She spoke about financial planning and long-term stability, using phrases that sounded borrowed from magazine articles and late-night television. I listened politely, thanking her for thinking of me, while my eyes drifted to the window where a pair of swallows had begun building a nest beneath the eaves. They moved with instinctive certainty, carrying bits of straw and mud without questioning whether the structure would hold. I envied that simplicity. When she finally mentioned Jason's growing stress about his business plans, the conversation shifted from gentle inquiry to subtle persuasion. She suggested that families thrive when resources are shared wisely, that trust was demonstrated through action rather than hesitation. I told her I appreciated her perspective and that I was still considering what role I could play in his future. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. After we hung up, I stood at the sink rinsing a single plate, watching the water spiral toward the drain, and wondered when kindness had begun to feel like a negotiation. That afternoon I drove out along the county road that bordered what used to be our property, slowing near the wooden gate that now bore a new lock and a fresh coat of paint. The field stretched out in familiar shades of green and gold, unchanged in their beauty yet entirely different in their meaning. I parked for a moment and let the engine idle, listening to the steady hum that reminded me life continued whether I was ready or not. Memories surfaced uninvited, of harvest seasons that left us bone-tired but proud, of evenings spent on the porch with Harold's arm draped across the back of my chair as we watched storms gather miles away. Those memories were not for sale, I realized. They belonged to me alone. As the days passed, Jason's messages became more frequent but shorter, stripped of the warmth he had once used as a bridge between us. He began to speak in timelines and projections, in numbers that demanded immediate attention. I responded with patience, repeating that decisions of this size required careful thought. Part of me still hoped he would understand, that he would remember the values we had tried so hard to teach him. Yet another part, quieter but increasingly certain, recognized that understanding might not be his goal at all. On Friday evening Martha joined me again on the porch, bringing a jar of homemade pickles and a story about her grandson's first baseball game. We laughed about small-town gossip and the stubbornness of weather forecasts, allowing ordinary conversation to stitch a fragile sense of normalcy back into the week. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she grew thoughtful and asked whether I felt safe living alone now that so much had changed. I told her safety was not always about locked doors or alarm systems. Sometimes it was about learning when to stand firm even if it meant standing alone. She squeezed my hand without pressing for details, and in that simple gesture I felt more supported than I had in months. Later that night I sat at Harold's desk reviewing documents Daniel Reeves had prepared, the legal language dense but reassuring in its clarity. Each paragraph outlined a future in which my choices remained my own, protected not by force but by foresight. I signed where indicated, my pen gliding across the paper with a steadiness that surprised me. Outside, the wind rose gently, carrying with it the distant sound of trucks along the highway and the promise of another season turning. I realized then that this chapter of my life was not defined by what I had lost, but by what I was finally learning to defend. Whatever expectations Jason carried with him the next time he crossed that threshold, he would find a mother who still loved him deeply, but no longer confused love with surrender. I woke to the sound of rain tapping steadily against the kitchen window, a gentle rhythm that reminded me of mornings long before money and expectations had begun to shape every decision I made. The house felt smaller somehow, as if the rooms themselves were drawing inward in quiet anticipation of what was coming next. I wrapped a wool shawl around my shoulders and moved through my routine with deliberate care, brewing coffee, watering the plants Harold had once insisted would never survive my forgetfulness, straightening the stack of documents Daniel Reeves had prepared for me the night before. Each action was simple, ordinary, yet beneath it all ran a current of awareness that refused to be ignored. Jason had not called in 2 days, which in itself was unusual enough to feel like a warning. When he finally appeared that afternoon, He did not knock. His car pulled into the driveway with a speed that sent gravel scattering like startled birds, and the engine remained running even after he stepped out. I watched him through the lace curtain above the sink, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands opened and closed at his sides as if rehearsing words that had already lost their shape. He entered the house with a determined politeness that felt heavier than anger ever could have been, greeting me with a nod instead of an embrace. The smell of damp earth followed him inside, blending with the faint scent of cinnamon from the pie Martha had left earlier that morning. We sat across from each other at the table that had witnessed nearly every turning point of my life, the wood worn smooth by years of shared meals and difficult conversations. Jason began speaking immediately, outlining a plan he had clearly memorized, complete with timelines, projected returns, and assurances that my involvement would be temporary. His voice carried the confident cadence of someone who believed logic alone could persuade the heart. I listened without interrupting, studying the familiar angles of his face and wondering when ambition had begun to overshadow empathy. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof in a steady percussion that made silence between his sentences feel even more pronounced. When he finished, he leaned back slightly as though expecting agreement to follow naturally, like the final note of a song resolving into quiet satisfaction. I folded my hands together and told him that I needed more time, that decisions rooted in a lifetime of work deserved patience rather than pressure. The words felt both fragile and unbreakable as they left my mouth. His expression tightened, not with fury but with a disappointment that seemed rehearsed for maximum effect. He spoke about loyalty and family responsibility, about how opportunities rarely waited for hesitation. I noticed how carefully he avoided mentioning my own needs, as though they were minor details in a story already centered on his future. The clock above the stove marked each passing second with impartial precision, reminding me that clarity often arrives not through confrontation but through persistence. Brittany called while he was still there, her voice bright on speakerphone, reinforcing his arguments with polished enthusiasm. She described scenarios in which shared investment could benefit everyone, her tone so reasonable it almost disguised the urgency beneath it. I thanked her for her concern and repeated that I would not be rushed into any decision involving the security of my remaining years. The call ended with courteous goodbyes that felt like carefully placed stepping stones across a widening gap. Jason stood then, pacing once around the room before stopping near the window where Harold used to stand each evening to gauge the weather. For a moment he seemed on the verge of saying something honest, something unguarded. Instead he exhaled slowly and gathered his keys, muttering that he would give me one more day to reconsider. The phrase lingered in the air long after the front door closed behind him. I sat alone at the table listening to the rain soften into a fine mist, realizing that the timeline he had set belonged only to him. My life, my choices, and the legacy Harold and I had built were not obligations to be fulfilled on demand. They were responsibilities I carried with quiet determination. As evening settled in, I lit a single lamp and reviewed the documents once more, tracing each clause with a finger as if committing the words to memory. Somewhere deep within the steady calm I had cultivated, a new certainty took root. Whatever Jason believed he could claim through insistence or persuasion, he would soon discover that my resolve was not as negotiable as he imagined. The next morning arrived with a stillness so complete it felt intentional, as if the world itself had decided to step back and observe what I would do. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee cooling untouched in my hands, watching low clouds drift across a pale sky that promised neither storm nor sunshine. It was the kind of in-between day that Harold used to call honest weather, the kind that forced you to make decisions without relying on signs from above. Jason had said he would give me one more day, and the weight of that deadline lingered in the quiet corners of the house like an unspoken challenge. I moved through the room slowly, noticing details I had overlooked for years, the faint scratch along the hallway wall from when Jason had learned to ride his bicycle indoors during one long winter, the dent in the pantry door where Harold had once dropped a toolbox after laughing too hard at his own joke. These memories felt less like burdens now and more like anchors, reminders that I had already survived seasons far more uncertain than this one. By mid-morning I gathered my purse and the neatly organized folder of documents Daniel Reeves had helped me prepare and drove back into town, the familiar route unfolding ahead of me in gentle curves bordered by wildflowers just beginning to bloom. The law office sat above a bakery that filled the street with the scent of fresh bread. a comforting contradiction to the seriousness of the decisions waiting upstairs. Daniel greeted me with a steady handshake, and a look that suggested he understood more than I had said over the phone. We reviewed each clause together, his calm explanations turning dense legal language into something almost reassuring. He spoke about autonomy and long-term protection, about the importance of structuring one's resources in a way that preserved dignity as well as security. I listened carefully, asking questions I would once have been too polite to voice, feeling a quiet strength build with every answer. When I signed the final page, the sound of my pen against paper felt like a promise I was making not only to myself but to the life Harold and I had built from nothing. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting bright rectangles of light across the sidewalk. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, aware that clarity often arrives disguised as ordinary routine. My phone rang just as I reached the car. Jason's voice carried a sharp edge of expectation as he asked whether I had reconsidered. I told him I had made arrangements that would allow me to help him in measured ways, but only after careful evaluation and without jeopardizing my own future. There was a long pause on the line, the kind that stretches so thin it almost disappears. He responded with restrained politeness, thanking me for my honesty while reminding me how much depended on timely cooperation. I could hear Brittany in the background offering suggestions he chose not to repeat. When the call ended, I placed the phone on the passenger seat and started the engine, feeling an unfamiliar sense of steadiness settle into my chest. The drive home seemed shorter than usual, perhaps because my thoughts were no longer circling the same doubts. That afternoon I sat at Harold's desk and began drafting a simple letter outlining the boundaries I had decided to set, choosing each word with care so that firmness would not be mistaken for cruelty. I wrote about love and responsibility, about the difference between support and surrender, about the importance of respecting the pace at which healing unfolds. By the time the light outside softened into evening gold, the letter lay completed before me, a tangible reflection of the resolve I had been quietly shaping for weeks. I sealed it in an envelope and placed it beside the lamp, knowing Jason would soon arrive to collect the answer he believed he had already earned. As the first stars appeared above the dark outline of distant trees, I realized that the outcome of our next conversation would not define my worth or diminish the years I had given to my family. Whatever disappointment he might carry away with him would belong to his expectations, not to my conscience. I turned off the porch light and sat in the gentle hush of the living room, ready at last to meet whatever tomorrow chose to bring. Jason arrived just after sunset, his headlights cutting long pale lines across the front yard before the engine finally went quiet. I had been expecting him, yet the sound still settled into my chest like the final note of a song I could not change. The envelope lay on the table where I had left it, beside Harold's reading glasses and the small brass clock that had marked every important moment of our married life. I did not rush to open the door. Instead, I finished rinsing the last coffee cup, dried my hands on a clean dish towel, and allowed the silence to gather around me like a shield. When I finally turned the knob, Jason stood there with a look I could not immediately name, something caught between impatience and hope, as if he believed this visit might restore the balance he had already decided was his right. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, his eyes moving quickly around the room as though measuring what had changed since the last time he crossed that threshold. The lamplight softened the lines of his face, making him appear younger for a fleeting second, and I felt a familiar ache rise before I gently set it aside. We sat down across from one another again, the same distance between us that now seemed wider than any field we had ever owned. I slid the envelope toward him without ceremony, watching the way his fingers hesitated before lifting it, as though he sensed the weight of what it contained. The rain had stopped hours earlier, leaving the night outside unusually clear, and through the window I could see a scatter of stars reflected faintly on the glass. Jason unfolded the letter slowly, his eyes moving across the page in small deliberate motions. I had written carefully, explaining that I had secured my finances in a way that would ensure stability for the rest of my life, that any assistance I might offer him would come in the form of guidance rather than unrestricted access, and that respect for these boundaries was the only path forward if we hoped to preserve what remained of our relationship. As he read, the steady confidence he had carried into the house began to falter in subtle ways, his shoulders drawing inward, his breath growing more measured. He asked quiet questions at first, seeking clarification, perhaps searching for loopholes hidden between the lines. I answered with patience, repeating that my decisions were not punishments but protections, not acts of mistrust but acknowledgments of reality. The clock on the table ticked on with unwavering rhythm, reminding us both that time did not pause for disappointment. Brittany called again, her voice audible through the thin speaker as Jason held the phone slightly away from his ear. She spoke rapidly, suggesting alternatives, urging him to persuade me to reconsider before opportunities slipped beyond reach. He listened without responding, his gaze fixed on the letter as though it might rearrange itself into a different conclusion if he stared long enough. When he finally ended the call, the quiet that followed felt deeper than any argument could have been. I realized then that persuasion had lost its power because certainty had taken its place. I stood and poured 2 glasses of water, setting one before him with the same care I had used when he was a child recovering from fever or disappointment. We spoke for a long time about practical matters, about the future he imagined and the one I was determined to secure, about the possibility that love could survive even when expectations could not. At some point he rose and walked to the window where Harold had once measured approaching storms, his reflection merging with the darkness outside. He remained there for several minutes, silent, perhaps considering how far the landscape between us had shifted. When he turned back, his expression was not one of anger but of reluctant understanding, the first sign that he had begun to recognize a boundary he could not simply cross. He gathered the letter and his keys, pausing at the door as though weighing whether to say something more. In the end he offered a brief nod, an acknowledgement that felt both fragile and real, before stepping out into the cool night air. I closed the door gently behind him and leaned for a moment against the solid wood, listening as his car faded down the county road. The house seemed to exhale, settling into a calm that had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. I returned to the table, straightened Harold's glasses, and allowed myself a single deep breath of relief, aware that the path ahead would still require strength but confident that I had finally reclaimed the right to walk it at my own pace. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet steadiness I had almost forgotten was possible, as if the house itself had decided to trust me again now that I had finally trusted myself. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains in soft golden strips, warming the worn floorboards and catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the still air. I found comfort in routine, in the simple rituals that had shaped my life long before uncertainty took up residence in every conversation. I brewed coffee, opened the windows and listened to the distant hum of traffic along the highway that led to towns I no longer felt the need to escape toward. Jason did not call for several days after that evening, and although part of me noticed the silence with a familiar ache, another part accepted it as the natural space that follows any hard truth. I spent those hours sorting through photographs I had not had the courage to revisit, arranging them in small boxes labeled with years that suddenly felt both far away and astonishingly close. There was Jason at 6 years old holding a fishing pole nearly taller than he was, grinning into the wind as Harold pretended to be unimpressed. There was our wedding anniversary on the porch, candles flickering while crickets filled the darkness with music. These memories no longer felt threatened by the future. They felt protected by it. On Thursday afternoon Martha stopped by again, carrying a basket of tomatoes from her garden, and a story about a neighbor who had finally fixed the squeaky gate everyone had complained about for years. We sat together in the kitchen with the windows open wide, letting the scent of sun-warmed earth drift in while she spoke about ordinary things that reminded me how life continues to move forward no matter how heavy the heart has been. She asked gently whether Jason had come back. I told her he had, and that we had reached an understanding that would take time to grow into something real. She nodded in quiet approval, as though she had been waiting to hear exactly those words. Later that evening I drove into town once more, this time not for appointments or paperwork but simply to walk along Main Street as the shops began closing for the night. The bakery lights glowed warmly through the front window, casting a sense of belonging onto the sidewalk that felt strangely new to me. I realized that I had spent so many years anchored to one piece of land that I had forgotten how wide the rest of the world could be. At the small park near the courthouse I sat on a wooden bench and watched children chasing one another beneath the dim glow of street lamps, their laughter rising into the cooling air like a promise that joy does not require permission. My phone buzzed in my purse and for a moment my heart tightened with the old reflex of anticipation. Jason's message was brief but thoughtful, asking if we could meet for coffee the following week to discuss his plans in more detail, and to understand what support I might realistically offer. I read the words twice, noting the absence of urgency, the careful respect in his phrasing. It was not an apology, but it was a beginning. I replied that I would be glad to meet him and suggested a place near the river where Harold and I had once stopped during long drives just to watch the water move past without asking questions. As I drove home under a sky scattered with stars, I felt something inside me loosen, like a knot that had been pulled tight for too long finally releasing its grip. The porch light glowed softly against the darkness when I pulled into the driveway, welcoming rather than warning. Inside, the house seemed larger than it had in weeks, each room holding space not only for memories but for whatever new chapters might arrive. I placed my keys beside Harold's clock and allowed myself a quiet smile, understanding that strength is often measured not in grand gestures, but in the steady refusal to abandon oneself. Whatever conversations lay ahead, whatever compromises might still be required, I knew now that the foundation beneath my feet was my own to maintain. I turned off the last lamp and stood for a moment in the gentle hush, grateful for the clarity that had grown from conflict and for the simple truth that the future, like the open road beyond the county line, was still mine to choose. I met Jason the following Tuesday at a small riverside cafe where wooden tables sat unevenly on a weathered deck, and the water moved past with the quiet certainty of something that did not need permission to continue. The morning was cool but bright, the kind of clear late spring day that made every color feel sharper than usual. And for the first time in weeks I noticed the simple pleasure of choosing what to wear without wondering how it might be interpreted. Jason was already there when I arrived, standing near the railing with a paper cup in his hand, watching the slow current as though he hoped it might offer him answers he had not yet found. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and for a moment neither of us spoke. There was no tension in his posture now, only a careful attentiveness that reminded me of the boy who once listened so intently when Harold explained how to read cloud patterns before a storm. We sat facing one another with the river stretching beyond his shoulder, its surface glinting in scattered fragments of sunlight. He began by thanking me for agreeing to meet, his voice steady but quieter than I remembered, as if he had learned that urgency does not always build trust. He spoke about his business plans in measured detail, outlining the challenges he faced and the ambitions he still carried. Yet this time he asked questions rather than issuing expectations. I listened with the same patience that had guided me through long seasons of uncertainty, aware that understanding does not require immediate agreement. When he finished, I told him what I had already decided in the quiet weeks behind me, that I would help him in ways that honored both his independence and my security, that advice and limited support could coexist with boundaries that would no longer be open for negotiation. The river's steady movement filled the pauses between our sentences, offering a rhythm that kept the conversation grounded, even when emotions threatened to rise. Jason nodded slowly, absorbing the reality of what I was offering and what I was not. He admitted that fear had shaped his urgency, that the weight of his own responsibilities had narrowed his perspective, until my choices felt like obstacles instead of expressions of a life fully lived. Hearing that honesty did not erase the distance that had grown between us, but it softened its edges enough for possibility to return. We spoke for nearly an hour about practical steps forward, about scheduled meetings with financial advisors, about timelines that respected both caution and progress. At one point he laughed unexpectedly at a memory of learning to drive the old pickup truck across a muddy field, and the sound carried across the deck like a fragile bridge connecting past and present. When we finally stood to leave, he placed his empty cup in the recycling bin and hesitated before reaching out to touch my shoulder. The gesture was brief but sincere, a quiet acknowledgement that relationships are not repaired through grand declarations, but through consistent respect. I walked back to my car with the sunlight warming my back and realized that the heaviness I had carried for so long had begun to lift, replaced by a clarity that felt both earned and enduring. The road home wound through stretches of open land dotted with new growth, and as I drove I found myself thinking not about what had been lost but about what remained within my power to shape. Harold had always said that resilience was less about surviving hardship, and more about deciding what to do with the lessons it leaves behind. That afternoon I unlocked the front door to a house that no longer felt like a battleground of expectations, but like a place of deliberate peace. I set my keys beside the brass clock and opened the windows wide, letting fresh air move through rooms that had witnessed both sorrow and renewal. Somewhere in the distance a train whistle sounded, long and low, marking another journey continuing beyond sight. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the quiet certainty of my own resolve, and understood that the future would not arrive as a single decisive victory, but as a series of steady choices made with dignity intact. Whatever paths Jason and I would walk from here, they would no longer be shaped by pressure or fear, but by the simple recognition that love, when paired with self-respect, can endure even the most difficult seasons. And as the evening light softened across the familiar walls, I allowed myself to believe that the life ahead, like the river we had watched together, would keep moving forward with or without the weight of what had once threatened to hold me back.